To comprehend the genesis of the Korean War, we must journey back in time to the close of World War II. As the dust of the global conflict settled, Korea, previously under Japanese rule, found itself split along the 38th parallel. This line of latitude became more than just a geographical divide, it was the line that separated two distinct ideologies. On one side we had the Soviet Union, a powerhouse of communism, who took control of the northern half. The United States, a beacon of capitalism and democracy, held sway over the southern half. This division was initially intended as a temporary solution, a way to maintain order until Korea could regain its footing. But as the years passed, it became increasingly apparent that this was not a temporary situation. The ideological chasm between the United States and the Soviet Union grew wider. The North and the South, each under the influence of their respective superpowers, began to develop under these separate ideologies. The North, under Kim Il-sung, adopted a socialist model, while the South, under Syngman Rhee, pursued a capitalist one. The 38th parallel was no longer just a line on a map, but a stark symbol of ideological division. As the 1940s drew to a close, this division began to heat up. The North and the South, each backed by their respective superpower, were on a collision course. These tensions culminated in an outright war on the Korean Peninsula, a war that would have far-reaching implications. On June 25, 1950, the simmering tensions exploded into warfare. It was on this day that North Korea, powered by Soviet tanks and aircraft, launched an unanticipated invasion into South Korea. This sudden act of aggression marked the ignition of the Korean War, a conflict that would profoundly shape the geopolitics of the latter half of the 20th century. The North Korean forces, armed and trained by their Soviet allies, moved with an alarming speed and efficiency. Within just a few short days, they had seized Seoul, the capital of South Korea, pushing the unprepared and outmatched South Korean army further south. The North's swift advance was a shock, not just to South Korea but to the entire world. In response, the United Nations Security Council convened an emergency meeting. They voted unanimously, with the exception of the absent Soviet Union, to intervene. It was a decisive moment in history, marking the first military action undertaken by the United Nations. The resolution called for an immediate ceasefire and the withdrawal of North Korean forces, but these demands fell on deaf ears. With the North Korean forces undeterred and continuing their advance, the United States swiftly stepped into the fray. Under the banner of the United Nations, American troops were dispatched to the Korean Peninsula. The U.S., still shaken by the memories of World War II, now found itself embroiled in a new conflict, this time on Asian soil. The American involvement marked a significant escalation in the conflict. It was no longer just a civil war, but a war that had the potential to draw in other major powers and spread beyond the borders of the Korean Peninsula. The rapid advance of the North Korean forces, the intervention of the United Nations, and the subsequent American involvement all contributed to the high-stakes, high-tension environment of the early days of the Korean War. The Korean War had begun in earnest, with the stakes higher than ever. The world watched on with bated breath as the battle lines were drawn and the war machine roared into life. The war, however, was far from a one-sided affair. At the helm of the United Nations forces, General Douglas MacArthur led a successful counteroffensive, dramatically changing the dynamics of the conflict. The North Korean forces, who had been on the offensive, found themselves pushed back past the 38th parallel, the line that had once served as a buffer between the North and the South. This was a resounding victory for the United Nations and South Korea, but it was more than just a military triumph. It was a symbolic victory, a statement that the international community would not stand idly by in the face of aggression. It sent a powerful message, not just to North Korea, but to the world at large. Yet for all the euphoria of this victory, it came with its own set of challenges. General MacArthur, emboldened by the success of the counteroffensive, made a controversial decision. He chose to press on into North Korea. This move was not without its critics. Some saw it as a necessary step to ensure the complete defeat of the North Korean forces. Others, however, feared that it was a dangerous escalation, a move that could potentially draw other powers into the conflict. The decision to press on into North Korea was a gamble. It was a gamble that the North Korean forces would not be able to regroup and launch a counterattack. It was a gamble that the international community would continue to support the United Nations forces. And above all, it was a gamble that the conflict would remain contained within the Korean Peninsula. Yet for all the risks, the decision was made. The United Nations forces pressed on, pushing deeper into North Korean territory. They were driven by a sense of momentum, a belief that they could bring a swift end to the conflict. But as they pushed further north, they were stepping into uncharted territory. They were venturing into a region where the stakes were high and the potential for disaster was even higher. The war was about to enter a new, even more dangerous phase. In late 1950, a new player entered the fray, the People's Republic of China. Not content to sit on the sidelines, China threw itself headlong into the Korean conflict. Alarmed by the United Nations forces edging closer to the Chinese border, China made a decisive move. A massive intervention on the side of North Korea, led by the imposing figure of General Peng Dehuai, was set in motion. The Chinese intervention was a game-changer. Their entrance into the war was like a tidal wave, washing over the Korean peninsula and completely altering the course of the conflict. The United Nations forces found themselves confronted with an enemy that was daunting in both numbers and sheer determination. The war, which had seemed on the brink of resolution, was once again shrouded in uncertainty. This new force did not merely tip the scales, it upended them completely. The People's Republic of China's involvement in the war resulted in a stalemate that would last for the next 2 years. The battle lines were drawn, and neither side seemed willing or able to make significant headway. But the deadlock on the battlefield belied the devastating human cost of this conflict. The toll was heavy on both sides. Soldiers and civilians alike fell victim to the violence of war, their lives cut short or irrevocably altered. The Korean peninsula was a landscape of devastation, scarred by the ravages of a war that seemed to have no end in sight. The human cost was a stark reminder of the tragic reality of war, a reality that was all too often overshadowed by the political maneuverings and strategic calculations. It was a war of attrition, fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with the lives of the men, women, and children caught in the crossfire. Despite the deadlock, a peaceful resolution was still far off. The Chinese intervention had indeed changed the course of the Korean War, but it had also set the stage for a protracted and bitter struggle, the ramifications of which would be felt for years to come. Finally, after 3 years of brutal conflict, an armistice was signed on July 27, 1953. With the ink barely dry on the document, the world breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the truce, to many, was less of a conclusion and more of an intermission. The terms of the armistice were as complex as the war itself. It called for a cessation of all hostilities, a withdrawal of troops, and the establishment of a 4-kilometer-wide buffer zone, the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. This strip of land, stretching across the Korean peninsula, was to serve as a line of separation between North and South, a physical manifestation of a nation divided. Yet the armistice was not a peace treaty. It did not formally end the Korean War. It was merely a ceasefire, a pause in the fight, a promise to ensure a complete cessation of hostilities and of all acts of armed force in Korea until a final peaceful settlement is achieved. That final peaceful settlement, however, has remained elusive. A peace treaty, a document to formally and legally end the war, was never signed. And so, the Korean War, in a very real sense, has never truly ended. It's a conflict suspended in time, a historical paradox of a war that's over, yet not. The establishment of the DMZ, far from being a symbol of peace, has instead become a stark reminder of ongoing tensions. It's a no man's land, a stretch of territory where soldiers stand face to face, where every movement is watched, every gesture scrutinized. It's a place of high alert and higher tensions, a representation of a war on pause. And so, the Korean War, a conflict born out of ideological differences, marked by a fluctuating frontline and punctuated by China's unexpected intervention, did not end in a decisive victory for either side. It ended in a stalemate, a draw, a pause, a war unfinished and unresolved. The echoes of this conflict continue to reverberate on the Korean peninsula. They're heard in the rhetoric of politicians, in the march of soldiers along the DMZ, in the quiet unease of a peace that's not quite peace. They're a reminder that the Korean War, while relegated to the pages of history, still has a profound influence on the present. And so the Korean War ended, not with a bang but with a whimper that still echoes today.